The desert stretched endlessly, a sea of scorched earth and brittle grass that crumbled under the weight of the Arizona sun. The sky was a blinding white blue, and the air shimmered with heat so fierce it felt as though the ground itself might crack open. A lone man rode slowly along the dusty trail, the reins slack in his hands, his hat pulled low to shield his weary eyes. His name was Thomas Callahan, a rancher of little means and fewer prospects. His ranch, if one could call a scattering of cattle and a sagging cabin a ranch, barely sustained him. He was a man who had learned to live lean. A single tin cup for water, a single skillet for cooking, and a single bed to collapse on after long days of work. Yet despite his hardships, he carried within him a stubborn heart. One that refused to grow hard in a world that often demanded it. That morning, he had set out with his old mule, drawn wagon to gather firewood from a dried creek bed. The land around him was silent except for the faint buzz of cicadas, and the occasional screech of a hawk circling far overhead. But as he descended into the cracked basin of the creek, something caught his eye. Two shapes lying still against the pale sand. At first Thomas thought they were fallen tree trunks, the kind that sometimes tumbled into the bed after storms. But as he drew closer, his chest tightened. These were not logs, these were people. He stopped the wagon abruptly, heart pounding. His hand went instinctively to the rifle slung by his side, though he didn't raise it. Slowly, cautiously, he stepped down, boots crunching in the dry sand. The figures were women. Their dark hair was tangled with dust and sweat, their skin bronzed by both heritage and merciless sun. They were dressed in buckskin garments, tattered and torn. But what struck Thomas most was their size. They were enormous, towering women whose limbs stretched long and strong, built like warriors yet crumpled now in weakness. He crouched beside them, squinting in disbelief. Each breath they drew rattled like dry leaves, their lips were cracked, their throats raw with thirst. Their eyes fluttered but did not open. "Lord have mercy," Thomas whispered. He glanced around nervously, every instinct warning him of danger. These women were Apache. He had heard the stories all his life: raids on settlers, arrows in the dark, families vanishing without a trace. Every white rancher in these parts was raised to fear the Apache. And now here he was, standing over two of their women. Giants, no less, helpless on the ground. If he helped them and their people found out, would they kill him for touching their kin? If he left them here, the desert would finish them before another sunrise. His mule brayed impatiently, as if urging him to decide. Thomas looked at the sisters again. Despite their great size, they seemed oddly vulnerable, like fallen trees stripped of their leaves. Something stirred in him, something deeper than fear. He thought of his mother, long gone now, who had once told him, "You'll be judged not by what you say, Thomas, but by who you help when no one's watching." With a sigh heavy as the desert air, he muttered, "God help me. I can't leave here." He hurried back to the wagon, fetched his waterskin, and carefully lifted one woman's head. Her skin was hot to the touch, her throat rasping as he trickled water between her lips. She swallowed weakly, then the other followed, both clinging to life. Getting them into the wagon was another trial. They were heavy, far heavier than any man he'd ever carried, and Thomas strained every muscle just to drag one across the sand. Sweat poured down his brow, his shirt clung to his back, and more than once he nearly collapsed himself. But at last, with grunts and prayers, he heaved both women into the bed of his wagon, laying them gently against sacks of hay. The mule shifted uneasily as if aware of the weight of his new passengers. "Easy now," Thomas soothed, patting its neck. "We're all in this together." As he climbed back onto the seat and tugged the reins, he cast one last wary look at the horizon. The desert was vast and empty, but he couldn't shake the feeling of unseen eyes watching from the ridges. Still, he pressed on, wagon wheels groaning over rocks and sand. Behind him, the sisters stirred faintly, one of them managing a hoarse whisper he couldn't understand. Her hand, large and calloused, reached out weakly, brushing against the wood of his wagon, as if to anchor herself to the world. Thomas's jaw tightened. Whatever storms this choice would bring, he had already made it. He was taking them home. And so the poor rancher carried with him not just two wounded strangers, but the weight of a decision that would soon change his life forever. The wagon creaked and groaned as Thomas urged the mule toward his modest homestead. A lonely cluster of wood, and stone that squatted at the edge of the desert plains. The journey back was slow. Each bump and rut in the dirt road threatened to jostle the two unconscious sisters from their fragile rest. Sweat trickled down Thomas's face, but he did not stop. When he finally pulled into the yard, the ranch looked even smaller than usual. The cabin's roof sagged from years of sun and rain, and the coral fence leaned like tired shoulders. A battered well stood to the side, its rope frayed and its bucket dented. This was no place for honored guests or wounded warriors, yet it was all he had. Thomas set the brake on the wagon, climbed down, and stood for a long moment with his hands on his hips. He had brought them this far. Now came the harder part, keeping them alive under his roof. The first sister stirred, her eyes half opening. They were dark, deep-set, filled with confusion and exhaustion. She muttered something in Apache, words Thomas didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable fear, perhaps even anger. The second stirred as well, groaning low, her great frame shifting unsteadily. "Easy now," Thomas said softly, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "Ain't no harm coming to you here." Whether they understood him or not, he couldn't tell. But they didn't resist when he carefully helped them down from the wagon. It took all his strength to steady them, his shoulders straining under their immense weight, but he managed to guide them into the cabin. Inside, the single-room home was cramped. A rough wooden table stood near the hearth, a narrow bed against one wall, and shelves lined with jars of beans, flour and cornmeal. Everything smelled faintly of smoke and earth. As the sisters sat on the bed, their sheer size made the old frame groan in protest. Thomas fetched a bucket of water from the well, setting it before them with a ladle. The women drank deeply, each swallow sounding like salvation. He tore pieces of bread from a loaf, and offered them as well, watching silently as they ate, their movements slow but desperate. For a time, the cabin was filled only with the sound of chewing, and the crackle of fire. Thomas leaned against the doorframe, studying them. Up close, he could see scars etched along their arms and shoulders, marks of hardship, perhaps battle. They were not just women, they were warriors of a proud people. And here they were, under his roof, depending on him. The thought made his stomach twist. That evening, after settling them with blankets, and filling the fire with fresh wood, Thomas stepped outside into the cooling desert air. The sky was awash in purples and oranges as the sun sank low, and the wind carried the smell of sagebrush. But instead of peace, Thomas felt unease gnawing at him. Word would spread quickly. Neighbors often rode by on their way to town, and someone was bound to notice the wagon tracks leading to his place. If they found out he was sheltering Apache women, there'd be trouble, maybe worse than trouble. Settlers feared the Apache and fear bred hatred. Some men in town would be all too eager to drag him out and string him up as a traitor. He kicked at the dust, muttering to himself, "What have you done, Thomas, you fool?" The next morning, his fears proved justified. A neighbor, Ezekiel Brown, rode up on horseback just as Thomas was hauling water. Ezekiel was a thick-set man with a permanent sneer, always quick to judge and quicker to spread rumors. "Mornin', Callahan," Ezekiel drawled, eyeing the yard suspiciously. "Heard your wagon wheels cutting deep into the trail yesterday. What'd you bring back from the desert?" Thomas forced a casual shrug. "Just wood. Creek bed's drying up. Figured I'd better stockpile." Ezekiel leaned forward in his saddle squinting. "Funny thing, rumor in town is some Apache scouts were spotted near here. Big ones. Folks are saying they're hunting for something. Or someone." Thomas felt his throat tighten. "Ain't seen a soul," he lied quickly. Ezekiel smirked, though his eyes stayed sharp. "That so? Well, I reckon you'd best keep it that way. You get tangled up with Indians, even by accident, it won't just be them you'll answer to. Folks round here don't take kindly to sympathizers." With that, he tugged the reins and rode off, dust trailing behind him like suspicion itself. Thomas stood frozen, heart pounding. He knew Ezekiel would spread whispers, and whispers could become a storm. Back inside the cabin, the sisters watched him with quiet intensity. One of them, the taller of the two, lifted her hand slowly, placing it over her chest, then pointing at him. Her eyes softened as if to say, "You saved us." Thomas exhaled heavily, pulling up a chair. He studied their faces in the firelight, seeing not enemies, but human beings who had suffered and survived. "You're safe here," he said, even if they couldn't understand the words. Whatever comes, we'll face it. That night, as coyotes howled in the distance and the desert wind rattled the shutters, Thomas lay awake on the floor, staring at the ceiling beams. He had little food, little water, and less protection. But somehow, in the presence of the sisters, he felt a strange calm, as though kindness itself was a shield. He did not know it yet, but the very decision that put his life in danger would soon bring him before the most powerful man of the Apache, their chief, and change his fate forever. Dawn broke with a pale, golden light that spilled across the desert, turning the sand into a shimmering sea of fire. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of sagebrush carried on the wind. Thomas had barely slept. He sat on the porch of his cabin with a tin cup of coffee, eyes fixed on the horizon. The sisters were inside, resting fitfully, though one of them had woken in the night to sit by the fire. They spoke little, their words a low murmur in a language Thomas couldn't understand. But he could feel it, the tension, the restlessness, the sense that something was coming. And then it did. At first, it was faint, an almost imperceptible vibration in the ground, like distant thunder rolling low across the plains. The mule in the corral lifted its head nervously, ears twitching. Thomas stood slowly, heart hammering. The sound grew louder, hoofbeats. Dozens of them. Dust rose on the horizon, a swirling cloud that expanded with every passing second. Shapes emerged within it. Mounted riders, moving with precision and speed. Their silhouettes dark against the morning sun. Thomas swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. He knew who they were before he could even see the paint on their horses. Apache. He darted back inside, where the sisters were already stirring, their faces grim. One of them, her expression sharp with understanding, pushed herself up, towering even in weakness. She placed her hand on Thomas's chest as if to steady him. Her dark eyes locked with his, and though no words were spoken, he knew what she meant. They have come. The ground trembled as the riders closed in. Within minutes, the cabin was surrounded. 24 warriors. Feathers and beads swaying in their hair, rifles slung across their backs, bows strung and ready. Their painted faces gave them the look of spirits called from another world. And at their head rode the chief. He was a formidable figure, his posture regal on horseback. His long hair, streaked with gray, fell in braids over his shoulders, and his eyes, dark, piercing, unblinking, took in everything with calm authority. He wore a necklace of bone and turquoise that caught the morning light, and his spear was adorned with eagle feathers that stirred gently in the breeze. Thomas stepped outside. His hands raised slightly to show he held no weapon. He could feel every muscle in his body trembling, though he tried to stand tall. This was the moment his neighbors had warned him of. Apache wrath at his very doorstep. The warriors shifted uneasily, some glaring at him with hatred, others with suspicion. But the chief remained silent, his gaze moving from Thomas to the cabin. Then, before Thomas could speak, the door creaked open. The sisters stepped outside. Though still weak, they carried themselves with dignity, standing shoulder to shoulder like towering pillars. Their presence alone silenced the murmurs of the warriors. The taller one raised her hand, her voice strong despite her exhaustion. She spoke in Apache, words flowing like water, sharp with meaning. The chief dismounted slowly, never breaking eye contact with his daughters of the tribe. He walked toward them, his footsteps measured, his face unreadable. The other warriors followed his every movement, waiting for his judgment. Thomas's heart thudded in his chest. He expected the end, expected the chief to condemn him for daring to touch their sacred kin, for bringing them under his roof. But what happened instead left him breathless. The sisters gestured toward Thomas, their voices rising with urgency. They spoke of the wagon, the water, the bread, the fire that had kept them alive. They pointed at the poor rancher with a kind of reverence, their words painting a story of mercy in the heart of the desert. The chief stood before Thomas now, close enough that Thomas could see the deep lines etched into his weathered face. His eyes, sharp as flint, studied him in silence. The world seemed to hold its breath. Finally, the chief spoke, his voice deep and steady, carrying across the gathered crowd like the roll of thunder. Though Thomas didn't understand the language, the tone was unmistakable, commanding, final, absolute. One of the sisters repeated the words for the others, and immediately the warriors gasped, some even lowering their heads in disbelief. A ripple of shock spread through the circle. The chief had not come for vengeance. He had come to decide the fate of the man who had saved his people's daughters. And his decision would change everything. The desert air hung heavy with silence. Every warrior in the Apache circle fixed their eyes on the chief, waiting for his judgment. The sun was climbing higher now, turning the dust into golden haze around the gathering. Thomas stood rigid, his palms damp, heart pounding so hard he could hear the blood rushing in his ears. He had been prepared for death. An arrow through the chest, a rifle butt to the skull. A swift punishment for trespassing against the Apache. What he wasn't prepared for was the stillness. The way the chief's eyes seemed to bore into his very soul. The chief spoke again, his voice deep and slow, as though each word carried the weight of history. The sisters stood beside Thomas, translating in broken English as best they could. This man, one sister said, her hand sweeping toward Thomas, did not run. Did not fear. He gave us water, food and fire. The chief lifted his hand, silencing the murmurs of his warriors. He stepped closer, until he stood barely an arm's length from Thomas. His gaze was so steady, so unyielding, that Thomas felt stripped bare under it. "You are poor," the chief said suddenly, in halting English. His voice was like gravel, low and resonant. "Your house is small. Your cattle are few. Yet you gave what you had." Thomas blinked, startled that the chief spoke his tongue. The Apache leader circled him slowly, studying him as one might study a strange creature. Then he stopped and turned to his warriors, raising his voice in Apache. The desert seemed to come alive with his words, rolling, powerful, filling the air like a chant of judgment. The translation came rough but clear through the sisters. "This man is no enemy. He is a man of honor. He has saved those who carry the blood of our people. For this, he shall not die." A murmur erupted among the warriors, some nodding with solemn respect, others shifting uneasily as if the ground itself had tilted beneath them. But the chief was not finished. He raised his spear high, the eagle feathers trembling in the breeze, and declared in a thunderous voice, "He is now our brother. A blood brother of the Apache." Gasps rippled through the circle. Warriors exchanged stunned glances, their painted faces betraying disbelief. To grant such an honor to a white settler, especially in these years of war and mistrust, was unheard of. Thomas felt his knees weaken. He understood the words well enough. Blood brother. The phrase struck him harder than any bullet could have. The chief stepped forward and drew a small blade from his belt, its handle decorated with turquoise stones. He extended it toward Thomas. For a moment, Thomas hesitated, his hands trembled, his mind racing. This was no small gesture, it was a covenant, a binding tie stronger than any treaty signed in ink. The chief's eyes locked on his, unblinking, waiting. Finally, Thomas extended his hand. The blade's edge grazed his palm, a shallow cut, a bead of red welling up instantly. Without hesitation, the chief did the same, slicing his own hand before pressing their palms together. Blood mingled with blood. A hush fell over the gathering. The Apache warriors, once suspicious and hostile, now bowed their heads in respect. The chief spoke once more, his tone softer now, though no less commanding. "You are poor in land. But now you are rich in family. No Pai will raise hand against you. Our fire is your fire. Our food is your food. Our enemies are your enemies." The sisters bowed their heads, eyes shining with emotion. One of them touched Thomas's shoulder gently, whispering, "Brother." Thomas swallowed hard, struggling to find words. I only did what was right," he stammered. "Didn't figure it would bring me here." The chief studied him, then gave the faintest of smiles, more a flicker than a full expression, but it carried the weight of acceptance. "Sometimes," the chief said, "a man finds more by giving than by keeping." For the first time since the warriors had arrived, Thomas felt the knot in his chest loosen. Relief washed over him like cool water. Though he knew this was not just relief. It was the beginning of something new, something far greater than himself. The decision had been made. The poor rancher was no longer alone. He was now bound to the Apache by blood. The days that followed felt like something out of a dream. For years, Thomas Callahan had lived in quiet obscurity. A poor rancher on the edge of survival, eking out a life in the desert with little more than stubborn grit. But now, the rhythm of his life changed in ways he could scarcely believe. The Apache warriors who had once surrounded his cabin with suspicion returned in peace. They brought gifts: smoked venison, bundles of herbs, leather flasks of fresh water carried from deep springs Thomas had never known. Where once he feared raids and arrows in the night, now he heard the sound of hooves approaching, and felt only reassurance. The chief himself visited again, standing tall in the doorway of the humble cabin, his presence commanding yet calm. He placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder, speaking through one of the sisters who translated. "You saved life," she said, eyes glowing with pride. "Now life will be given back to you." And it was. The Apache showed him where the wild horses roamed free, teaching him how to catch and break them with patience instead of force. Within weeks his barren corral filled with strong, proud steeds. Creatures that fetched high prices in the town market. For the first time in years, Thomas's debts lightened, and his ranch began to breathe with new promise. They taught him too how to read the desert. The way to find water by the bend of a cactus. The signs of weather in the flight of birds. The secret trails hidden in the rocks. What had once been a hostile land now revealed itself as a living ally, rich with hidden gifts. But the greatest gift of all was the bond itself. The giant sisters, whose lives he had saved in the desert, became frequent visitors. Their laughter filled the small cabin, their hands steady and strong as they helped mend fences or grind corn by the fire. Though their size and presence awed him still, Thomas came to see past their strength to the gentleness within. They treated him as family, as one of their own. In the nearby town, whispers spread quickly. Folks couldn't believe what they heard. That Thomas Callahan, the poorest rancher among them, now walked under Apache protection. Some scoffed, some sneered, some warned he'd brought a curse upon himself. But none dared lay a hand against him. Not when the desert itself seemed to watch over his ranch. One evening, as the sun bled crimson across the horizon, Thomas sat outside with the chief and the sisters. The desert wind was warm, carrying with it the faint scent of mesquite smoke. The chief spoke softly, his voice a low rumble in the twilight. "You are no longer alone," he said, his English halting but strong. "You gave what little you had, and now you have much. Remember this: the measure of a man is not in the cattle he owns, but in the hearts he touches." Thomas bowed his head, humbled to the core. He thought back to the day he had found the sisters, lying helpless in the dry creek bed. He had been poor then, poorer than ever, yet in that moment he had given all he had: water, food, shelter. And by doing so, he had gained something beyond price. Family. As the stars bloomed across the vast desert sky, Thomas felt a peace he had never known before. The fear that had once haunted his nights was gone. Replaced by the warmth of belonging. He was no longer just a struggling rancher on the edge of the world. He was a brother of the Apache. And in the silence of that sacred bond, Thomas knew that kindness, the simple act of reaching out when no one was watching, had changed his life forever.